Right. So as I was saying, let's talk about validation and where you want to make sure that the information that is being gathered is of the correct data type, the correct range, the correct format, and the usual philosophy in when you're doing validation is that you do it as soon as possible, as early as possible, and also you do it as often as possible. Right, so that as early as possible means right there in the user interface, right? So we want to first of all design the user interface to avoid or minimize as much as we can the possibility of making mistakes, right? So for instance, if we're asking for values that we know have a particular range, we might provide users with a drop down as opposed to as an input field, right? Because in the input field they might type all sorts of things, unrestricted text, whereas from a drop-down they can only choose from a restricted set of values, right? Same thing with dates, right? As opposed to having them type the date, instead we provide them with a widget, right, from where they can select the date, right? So we try to minimize the possibilities of users making mistakes, right? Whenever possible, we would like to avoid input fields altogether, right, because they are unrestricted text, right, and folks can type all sorts of weird and characters that might be dangerous characters, right, that if we don't design it correctly, those characters might actually hurt us, right, on the back end. So as early as possible, but also as often as possible, right? So not only at the front end we should validate, not only should we reduce the possibility of making errors, but we should be nevertheless be ready, if they circumvent the first defense, right? They actually are able to type in wrong data. We should validate it as often as possible in the JavaScript, right? Right before we submit. We should also validate it on the server side, right? Once it does make it to the server side, even though we might have done some validation on the front end, we should validate it again on the server side, right? And check to see that the things are the correct data types. If we were expecting a date, it has to be a date, right? If it's an integer, it better be an integer, right? Check if it's an email, then does it follow the format that we're expecting? So as much as possible, we should be as strongly typed as possible, right? And so we should check that we are getting the right data types. And so we validated on the client side, we validated on the server side, and we validated on the database side, right? The database will also have strong typing that is expecting data that is of a particular data type. Okay. Again, as much as possible, we want to avoid folks typing unrestricted text, right, or copying and pasting text into an input field. Okay. So today we'd like to talk about validation, but using the Angular framework. So Angular, being a client-side front-end framework, has already some validation that allow you to validate things on the front end. Okay, not that they don't do strong. They don't. They provide the libraries to highlight things and change the classes and give users feedback. They don't implement the strong typing and all the logic that would go beyond that, right? So I like to just cover that part here, the validation of correct formats and correct data types. That's just plain old JavaScript, okay? JavaScript executing on the client, executing on the server, and on the database. So I'd like to talk about Angular validation, form validation. And that's done through, that's documented here in Angular's forms. Forms is a couple of directives that Angular defines, right, on top of the form, so that it can add additional classes, add additional logic that allow you to write code based on whether the form is valid or a particular field is valid or invalid. Whether the field has been dirty, right? That somebody actually typed something in it, regardless of whether it's valid or invalid. Is it pristine, right? As it nobody has touched this field, so we can write logic about it and give users appropriate feedback based on the status of the overall form and based on the status of an individual field. Okay. But for this to work, we need to turn off the forms, the browser's native form validation mechanism. Right? As I mentioned earlier, the browser already implements some raw validation, right, on whether things are required or a particular data type, and we want to circumvent that. We want to take over the validation, right? So let me just demonstrate some of the validation that is already available out of the box. So let's create here under lecture. Let's create Angular validation. Angular validation. So let me just show you just an HTML that has just a form, just a basic form. So this is a native. So let's look at this. H1 native form validation. So this is the browser's validation, right? So this is not Angular's validation. So let's create a simple form. And let's create a couple input fields and say that it's a username. It's the default type. The default type is text. And we'll say that it's required. Right? Just by saying that it's required, the form, right, the browser will complain, right, if I try to submit this, right, without that value. Okay, so let's put here a submit button. Submit. And let's navigate here. So let me restart that. And let's navigate to localhost, Angular validation. This is lectures, right? Is that where I put it? Lecture, Angular validation, and this is native. Apparently not. That's not where I put it. Public, lecture, Angular. Oh, native. Did I spell it wrong? Navite. Okay, sorry. My dyslexia is it's eating me alive. Here we go. So we have native form validation. So if I sorry, if I submit this and I don't provide that value, notice that the form is not submitted, right? And we get this, please fill out this field, right? Because it's required. So this is out of the box, right? If I visit this with Safari or visit it with Chrome, right, it'll be a little bit different, and we don't have control over the styling. Right, if I submit, it'll be a. Oh, I guess I'm not getting it with. Really? With Firefox? Okay. Yeah. So I guess Firefox and Chrome support the latest. The Safari doesn't. Notice that the style is a little bit different. Okay. And we have no control over this. Excuse me, on how this is this is styled, how it's highlighted. We don't have control over that. We have a couple more. We have we can say that this is an email. If we say that this is an email, and the name of the field is email. Right. If I refresh this and not in Safari, I guess not. and I have the email. If I submit, if I provide the value and then I submit the email, wait, type email. Okay, I didn't say it was required, right? But if I put the wrong format, right, it's going to complain saying that this is not a valid email, right? It's missing the @ sign, it's missing the domain at the end, right? A period. So it's not the right format. So it does some soft validation. Okay, this is out of the box, and what we want to do is take over this mechanism and say, well, no, I don't want the default behavior for validation. I want to take over that behavior, right? So let's copy that and let's bring about the Angular way of doing things, right? So if we do Angular validation, okay, we call this Angular form validation. The first thing that we need to do is turn off the validation that the browser would do. Okay, and it says that don't validate this because I'm gonna take care of it, right? So to do that, one of the options here is to no validate. Okay, is the option. So if you select that option, you're turning off the browser's native validation mechanism, right? Because you don't want to see those error messages because we're going to handle it ourselves. Okay, so to do this, we're going to bring about the Angular library. Let's bring in Bootstrap first of all. So we'll go. It'll be CSS. Well, actually, go up one, go up twice, go up 3 times. There we go. And there's Bootstrap there. And let's bring about the Angular library. Okay. Let's declare this to be an Angular application. Validation app. And let's implement that in the script. Script. Jeez, I can't type today. All right, source. And in app.js. All right, let's keep it simple. Let's just declare a controller here that will handle this particular content. Right? Well, I'm not gonna declare a separate controller. Right? I'm just gonna declare it right inside of app.js, and it's not gonna be multiple pages and whatnot. Right? So I'm just gonna keep just one single page. All right. So let's bring the class container fluid and declare a controller here, the ng controller, and we'll call it the validation controller. Okay. All right. So let's do all that work inside of app.js, right? So let's create app.js. App.js, and in app.js, let's declare our application. And we'll say Angular module and its validation app. Is that what I called it? Yes. No dependencies. And we're going to declare a controller here called the validation controller. Implemented in a function of the same name. Okay? Everybody okay? All right. Now remember that we had the mechanism where we would use the instance of the controller, but we did that in using the config.js, right? Where we would declare the controller, and then we would say controller as, and we would give it the name model, meaning that's how I'm going to refer to the instance of the controller inside of the template. Well, you can achieve the same thing. You can achieve the same thing by using the as keyword here when you declare the controller. Right? If you don't need to declare many templates, it's just one template. You can still make use of that same good practice by using the as syntax here. So we can refer to the instance of the controller using model, right? Anyway, let's continue. So this username is required, right? So now if I refresh this and this becomes Angular, okay, and if we inspect, and we submit, notice that nothing's happening, right? Because we turned off validation. Right? We turned off validation, and these fields, there's nothing peculiar about them, right? Input, username, text required, nothing peculiar about them, right? But we no longer have the native browser's validation, right? It lets me submit it. It doesn't let me know anything about it. So let's bind this to a model, right? To an Angular model, using ng model. Okay. Now, by binding it, right? For instance, maybe something like user.username. Okay. By binding it, notice what happens. That not only do we get ng model equal user.username, notice that several other classes have been added. See this class? These classes were not there. Right? Notice that we have all these ng dash classes that were added based on validation. Okay. Now if I leave the form validation, right? It's gonna bug me, right? It's gonna take over the validation of the form, right? But so if I don't want the form to take over that, if we want to take over it, we use no validate. And once we do that, we can start making use of these additional classes, right? That tell me what the what is the status of this input field. Right? Notice that it says ng pristine. That means that no one has touched this field. Right? Nobody has typed anything. Right? If I go in there and type something, notice that it changed. Right? It no longer says pristine because it's not pristine. Somebody typed in it. So the class changed. So these classes can be used, right, to control the look and feel of these fields, as you interact with this input field. Okay. So for instance, it says before, right? Notice that it says ng invalid. Ng invalid. Why is it invalid? Well, because it said that it was required, right? Somewhere in here, the input field says that it's required. See that? Because it's required and there's nothing in the field, right? It tags it as invalid, right? If I remove the required, if I don't have the required, and I refresh, notice that this doesn't say that it's invalid anymore. See that? Actually, it says that it's valid. See, it says ng valid. Okay, empty is okay, right? Because it's not required. It's pristine. Nobody has typed in it yet, right? Untouched, also that's useful for touch interfaces, right? Nobody has put their finger on this field, right? So it also keeps track on whether somebody has touched it, right, with their fingers. And it's also ng empty. It's empty. Nobody has typed it. But as I start typing, notice that the classes change, right? Now it says that ng untouched. Okay, so yes, I haven't touched with my finger. I touch it with a keyboard, with the mouse. It's still valid, okay, because it's not following any regular expression. It's not empty. It's dirty. Okay, It's not pristine anymore. And valid parse, meaning if there was a parsing against some regular expression, it would have passed because there is no regular expression, so it matches any regular expression. Okay. The email. Notice that the email doesn't have any of this, right? Because we haven't tied it to any model yet. We haven't tied it to any model. If we tie it to a model, right, and we say that this is user.email, right, and we refresh, notice that now the input field also has these additional classes that were added to it, right? So it says it's pristine, untouched, it is valid, a blank email is a valid email, right? But as I start typing, notice that it changes, right? It becomes dirty. It's not empty. It is untouched. It's invalid because it's missing the @ sign, right? So if I keep typing, nothing changes until I hit the @ sign. Well, actually, no. The @ sign is not enough, right? It needs a period, right, between the domain and the top-level domain, right? So if I keep typing, notice that it says that it's valid. Oh, that's valid? Shouldn't be valid. Period. Now it's invalid. And finally, the top-level domain.com. See that? So using these classes, we could go back and give users some feedback on what's going on, right? If everything's okay. Notice that not only the input fields are being added with these classes, the form itself. Right, the form itself has classes, right? It has certain classes. It says that it's dirty, meaning any one or more fields in the form have been typed on, right? So it's brought up to the form whether any of the fields. So it summarizes the overall status of the input fields down below. It's valid because all the fields are valid. Right? If any field's invalid, the whole form is invalid, and the email is valid. Right? So it adds all these classes to the form, so you can write overall logic based on the form. Right? If I submit the form, notice that it adds ng submitted at the end. See that? Okay. So you could base your styles and your logic based on whether it has been submitted or not. Perhaps I don't want to give you feedback until you submit it, right? Perhaps the feedback, if you want to give feedback as you type, right, then you can ignore the submitted. But if you want to give feedback only when you submit, right, then you could filter on the ng submitted, right? So let's play around with this a little bit. Let's play around with this. So first of all, I'm going to paint these to have class form control, both of these, and the button I'm going to paint as bootstrap buttons. Okay, there we are. Okay. So we could write styles here that say something like style, ng invalid, right? Perhaps we want to paint it red or something, right? We could say maybe that the background color is red, right? So for instance, as I type, notice that it changes the color to be red. Notice that it changes the color of the overall form. See these edges here? That's because the form itself is invalid, but also this particular field is invalid, right? So that's why you see that. And notice if I add some form and I put some margins or some padding around it, notice that the overall form, right, gets a red because the form itself has an ng invalid class attached to it. So the whole form gets a background red, and the field, the input field that is invalid, right, gets also a background red, right? So as you type, so it's valid, right, and then I can make it look like that. That makes sense? But perhaps it's too jarring, right, that you give me feedback as I type and I haven't yet finished. Okay, so it's like don't yell at me. I'm not done yet, right? So perhaps you wanna wait, right, until the whole thing is submitted, right? So you could prepend the whole thing with submitted, right? So we could say that if it's ng submitted followed by an ng invalid, right? Then I will paint it red, right? So that as I type, right, I'm not highlighting yet, right, because it hasn't been submitted. But if I do submit it, then the whole thing turns red. Notice that it highlighted the form, right? It highlighted the form because this is the submitted by the form, and then the same form has an ng invalid, right? So they're together. Both classes are being applied to the form, right? But you might want to apply it also to the child fields underneath, right? So you could do something like submitted, and then inside, any field that also is invalid, I would like to highlight as well, right? So this would be ng invalid. I want the background color to be red, or dark red, or fire brick, Indian red. How's that? Right, so that if I type and I submit, notice that I have two different colors, right? The inner one, the Indian red, and then the outer for the form. Okay. Notice the difference, right? Notice that these are stuck together, right? There's no space in between, whereas this one says this is a hierarchical relationship, right? The parent has ng submitted, and then any fields underneath me, any children that might have ng invalid, then I want this color. Okay, that makes sense, right? I'm sorry?
As soon as our text box uses focus,
yep.
Is there some class for that?
There's ng well, that's ng pristine and ng dirty, right? Those are driven by focus, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Or you can be more specific and refer to the fields themselves. Okay. So for instance, you can have an object, a JSON object that represents the whole status, right, of this form. For that to work, we need to name the form. So let's call it form 1, right? So what this will do is that it will grab, right, the form and the fields, and it will create a JSON object, right, that will tell us what is the status of each one of the form itself, the overall form, and then the individual input fields, right? So for instance, I could in here I could say like to look at the form 1 validation status. Right, so underneath here, I like to display what is the JSON representation of the status of that form by name. Okay. So to do that, we could just say form 1. Okay, form 1. What happens is that the name of the form is added to the scope, the current scope, right? And representing all the status information that I know about that particular form, right? So if I refresh, right, notice that it adds all this information about the form itself, and then all the child elements, right, inside of that form. Okay, it says that the name of the form is form 1. Dirty is false. Notice that all these dollar signs, right? This means that these are all variables or attributes or properties that have been added by the framework, right? Just like $scope, $HTTP, all these are instances, right, of objects or strings or any variable, right, that has a $sign in front of it is because the framework created these variables, right? And these are, the closest thing that you can have as a keyword, right? They're keywords inside of the framework. They're not JavaScript keywords, right? But within they have special meaning inside of the framework, right? So the form 1 is not dirty. It is pristine. Nobody has touched it or typed on it, right? Nobody has released focus on it. Up to this point, it's valid. Okay. And then it also has information about the individual fields, which I don't see them here. Option. Oh yeah, there it is. Right. So there's email. Right. So it has all the fields, and you can look at any status information about that particular field. And somewhere in here is the username. Somewhere in there. Oh, there it is. Username. Okay. Or you can specify the status of a particular field. Right. What do I want to see about a particular field? So I can see the validation status about the username. Validation status. Right. So I could just look at form1 dot username. Right. So username, again, based on the name that we gave the field, I can reference it as part of an attribute of the parent form, right? So I can look at just that individual element, that form username, right? Again, things that says that it's not dirty, right? It's pristine. Nobody has typed on it. Nobody has touched it with their fingers, right? The name is username, and so on and so forth, right? The same thing with email. Okay. So what we'd like to be able to do is somehow, provide some feedback to the users as they interact with the form. One of the things that we could do is display some, maybe some overall error message at the top, right? That saying what's wrong with the form, and then we could go into more detail, right on the form, right on that particular field, right? Highlight it or put some error message down below it, right? So to do that, let's go to Bootstrap and borrow some of their styling to do this, right? For instance, they have these alert boxes that can be used, right, to very quickly just provide some quick feedback on what's going on. So let's grab this one, the red one, right? It's an alert. Okay, let's grab that and let's put it at the top of our page, like somewhere, maybe like down here, right? So let's put some default error messages like saying, there were errors in your form. Please try again or something, right? Fix those errors and try again. So let's if we do that, and notice that we get the form, that alert at the top, but it's always there. Right? But we don't want to show it all the time. Right? We want to show it when form dot valid is false, maybe, huh? Or notice that there's also invalid there. See that? Invalid. So we could say, show that red box only if form1 dot invalid is true. Right? Only show it if it's invalid. Okay, so we could do something like we could do here an ng show only if form1 $ invalid. Okay, remember what all these are attributes that are added by the framework, right? That easily can allow you to write some feedback for the user. Right? So if we refresh. It's not invalid, but if I submit, wait a minute, what's going on? Is the form invalid? I think it's a little bit too big. How's that? Let's look at the form. Form 1 ng and is still it is valid. Why is it valid? Oh, did I remove required? I did, didn't I? I removed required. That's why it was valid. Okay. So let's go back and put this as required. We refresh. Notice that immediately says invalid because there's nothing in the field, right? In the first field. If I start typing, it goes away, right? It goes away. If I start typing on the email and I have the wrong format, it immediately pops up, right? So this might be a little bit too jarring. It says, "Wait a minute, I'm not done. I'm filling out the form. Don't judge. Don't be so judgmental." So and as I go, right, it goes away and then it comes back and then it goes away again, right? That's a little bit too jarring, right? So what we might want to do is only show it if it's invalid and if it has been submitted, right? So only show it if it's invalid and form 1 has been submitted. Okay, right? So that if I go back, notice that it's not there, but if I submit, right, it'll come up and say there's something wrong, right? And then we can fix it, and it goes away. All right. Okay. Right. We also might want to give some feedback, right? Maybe under the text, perhaps we want to give a brief explanation of what's wrong, right? That and that would give the user some idea of what to do. So perhaps we can create here a small error message, right under the field, saying something like username is required, right? And under the email, we might say this email. The email format is wrong or something, right? That currently right now they always show, right? They always show, but we might style them and say that all errors color is red, okay, and maybe put some margin beneath of 10 pixels. Right? But I don't want to show them all the time. I only want to show them if there is a particular something wrong with that particular field, right? So what we could do is that only show this particular error, right? Only show this error, right? If form1.email.invalid, right? Now if I leave it like that, it will show the error as I type, right? So the email format is wrong as I type. Oh wait, what? Oh, not invalid. Username. Sorry, username. There it is. So username is required. So as I type, it goes away, right? Because I'm adding the value, or it can come back. And again, it can be specific to that particular field, right? So similarly, we can do something with the email, right? Meaning show this error if there's something wrong with the email field, right? Right. So notice that this is wrong because I haven't typed anything, but this one's okay because blank is okay. It's not required. The email is not required. But as when I start typing, it immediately checks to see if it matches the regular expression, right? And then it changes. Again, you can be more specific and say that I'm not going to tell you what's wrong with it until you actually submit. Right, so you could say you can combine this together with form 1 submitted. Right, so I'll tell you what's wrong if you submit. Right, when you submit. Now we have red on red, and you can't see that. Red on red. Okay. So we could say, I guess we could say .ng invalid .error color is white. There we go. It's white, right? Or the email. Did that make sense? Right? You might also want to provide some error messages at the top, right? Maybe list everything that's wrong, right? And then each field would be listed below. It's good to give as much information to the user of what's wrong, so that the user can fix all the problems, right? And then submit, as opposed to fixing one by one and giving the errors one by one. That's very annoying, right? So it's better to just let them know everything that is wrong, so that you can go and fix it, right? So we could have here, under here, we could have like a list of all the things that are wrong, right? So for instance, all the things that could be wrong is that the username is required, right? That that the email, so it could be the same error or it could be a different error message, right? But we're only going to show that. We're only going to show these only if you if that's what's wrong, right? Notice that the only thing that was wrong with this is that it was required, right? But it's showing to me all the errors, right? So we could again provide here some logic and show these only if, right, form1.username is invalid, right? And we could take the same approach for this, and this would be email is invalid, so that if I submit, notice that it only gives me, lists the error for that particular one that is invalid. Make sense? All right. I think that's the extent of it, right? That you need so far for our particular purpose. All right. Any questions? Yes. I'm sorry? Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could use all these various status about dirty and valid, touched, right? You can combine all those to meet your particular needs, right? That's why you have all these statuses, right? That you haven't even touched it, right? And same thing here, right? You can combine the same logic for way at the top. Yeah. All right. All right.